Hi, I'm Christina.
I'm Tara.
Hi, I'm Sahil.
And today we're going to be talking about our study investigating how to better understand which moderation systems the public views as most legitimate. The Canadian Supreme Court has made controversial decisions before, but has historically maintained a reservoir of goodwill. For instance, in 1982, the Canadian Supreme Court added the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to the Canadian Constitution, which increased the Supreme Court's power to intervene in policy. While this move was controversial at the time, in the long term, the Canadian Supreme Court was able to maintain strong support from the Canadian public. This suggests that these courts benefit from a reservoir of goodwill that forms the foundation of legitimacy, as postulated by political science professor James Gibson. When online platforms try to make similarly controversial decisions, they do not benefit from this reservoir of goodwill. For instance, 75% of Americans were found not to trust social media to make fair content moderation decisions, according to a survey done by the Cato Institute and YouGov. These issues are likely symptoms of a lack of legitimacy. Perceived legitimacy is defined as the acceptance of authority by those subject to it, and empirical studies show that when institutions are perceived as highly legitimate, this results in greater acceptance of unpopular decisions, as well as long-term cooperation and greater compliance. In this study, we examine how moderation processes and users' beliefs affect perceived legitimacy. This is done through two research questions. First, how does the type of moderation process impact the perceived legitimacy of content moderation? Second, how does the outcome alignment of a moderation decision with personal beliefs impact perceived legitimacy of the moderation process? We analyzed 4 content moderation processes that represent both conventional and emerging methods of content moderation in this study. The use of paid contractors and algorithms for moderation represent conventional methods, while the expert panel and digital jury are emerging solutions that were designed with the intent of building greater legitimacy. We hypothesized that the digital jury would be perceived as the most legitimate moderation process. This is followed by the expert panel, then the algorithm, and finally the paid contractor. This comes from the fact that digital juries and expert panels have more independence from platforms, and independence has been positively correlated with perceived legitimacy. In addition, digital juries most strongly embody the concept of democratic representation, which contributes to higher democratic legitimacy. Finally, prior work shows that overall algorithms are perceived to be more trustworthy than humans. With regards to outcome alignment, we hypothesized that decisions that align with users' beliefs would be perceived as more legitimate. This comes from research showing that confirmation biases can motivate reasoning, and in addition to that, people have other cognitive biases that are strongly mediated by partisan identification.
Okay, now moving on to study design. We conducted a within subjects experiment where we showed participants a selection of real Facebook posts that were matched with a randomly selected moderation process, one of the 4 processes mentioned earlier, and a randomly selected moderation outcome, i.e. was the post left up or taken down. The posts were real Facebook posts that were selected for potentially violating the hate speech, incitement to violence, or misinformation sections of Facebook's community standards. However, we don't know what moderation decision, if any, was actually made by Facebook for each post. This is an example of a post that was actually shown to survey participants. The first thing participants were shown was a post and a question asking whether they believed the post should be taken down or left up. Next, participants were presented with a randomly selected moderation decision made by a randomly selected process and asked a series of questions about how they felt about this decision. And finally, participants were asked to rate the moderation process on fairness, impartiality, and trustworthiness. We sent the survey out to 100 US-based Facebook users that were sourced from Amazon Mechanical Turk.
Moving into analysis and findings. We analyzed the survey responses we collected with a linear mixed effects model. This model estimated the perceived legitimacy of decisions using process, outcome alignment, gender, and political affiliation as explanatory variables. We also corroborated our quantitative analysis with qualitative analysis of free response questions that we asked at the end of the survey, wherein we asked participants to reflect on the various processes. Our findings indicate that expert panels benefit from greater perceived legitimacy compared to the other processes. This was shown through our quantitative results, but also supported by qualitative feedback given by participants in the free responses. However, outcome alignment, or whether or not participants agreed with the moderation decision, was an even stronger factor than moderation process itself in determining perceived legitimacy. This becomes clearly evident when we overlay the effects of outcome alignment on a graph of the process effects. In fact, outcome preference alignment was responsible for 27% of the observed variation in perceived legitimacy. Overall, we saw that mistrust appears to be an overriding factor compared to the democratic benefits of digital juries for participants, leading to lower than expected perceived legitimacy. For digital juries, however, there are many factors, including jury composition, that might lead to greater or lesser trust. In addition, perceived legitimacy is vulnerable to a lack of understanding of the processes involved, as well as misconceptions about them. And finally, in a polarized environment, it can be extremely difficult to create broad legitimacy for any process, because strongly held beliefs may place an effective cap on perceived legitimacy. It's also important to note that these beliefs can be shaped by many factors, including community norms, individual experience, in-group versus out-group dynamics, and finally, prevailing political discourse.
In summary, we investigated which moderation systems the public views as most legitimate. We conducted a within-subjects experiment that measured the perceived legitimacy in the context of randomized moderation decisions. From this experiment, we saw that expert panels have the highest legitimacy. We also saw that agreement with the decision plays a larger role than process itself in determining legitimacy. From this, we recommend that content moderation systems incorporate more transparency, create or highlight positive content or moderation experiences, and continue to visibly incorporate expertise into content moderation. Thank you for listening.